Every September morning, before the sun cleared the ridgeline, trucks rolled out of the Mercer family orchard, carrying pears that would never see a grocery shelf. Bruised pears, scarred pears, pears with hail marks like old freckles across their skin. Most went to compost. Some went to the hogs down the road. The rest simply rotted in a ditch behind the packing shed, sinking slowly into the Virginia clay. But one truck never went to the ditch. It stopped at the end of a gravel driveway, at a 15-acre farm tucked into the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where a widow named Hannah Carter was already waiting with cash in her hand and a weathered burgundy journal tucked under her arm. She paid for every load, every single one. The neighbors laughed. Some shook their heads. A few even worried about her. Hannah just picked up a bruised pear, turned it slowly in her palm, opened her journal, and made a note. Why would anyone build a future out of fruit nobody wanted? Hannah was 35 when her husband passed, leaving her a small farmhouse, a neglected packing shed, a stack of unpaid bills, and almost nothing in savings. She had a daughter to raise and a mortgage that didn't care about grief. She wasn't a farmer by training. She was a farmer by necessity, and by a quiet, stubborn belief that had followed her since childhood. Nothing grown by nature should be wasted. That belief led her, one grey autumn morning, to the office of David Mercer, the 59-year-old manager of the region's largest commercial pear orchard. "We reject almost 30% of our crop every harvest," David told her, leaning against a wall of cardboard bins. "Cosmetic stuff, mostly. Bruises, odd shapes, sun scald. Fruit's perfectly good to eat, just not pretty enough to sell." "What happens to it?" Hannah asked. "Compost, livestock. Some of it just goes bad in the lot." Hannah looked out at a bin of pears, golden and freckled with brown. "Can I have a load?" David laughed, not unkindly. "You can have all of it if you want. Saves me the disposal fee." Hannah didn't blink. "Then I want all of it." David didn't understand it. Nobody did. But he shook her hand anyway. By October, Hannah's packing shed, once full of cobwebs and broken shelving, was stacked with crates of rejected pears. The smell of ripening fruit drifted across the property. Children in the area started calling it the pear dump. Her neighbor, Carl Bennett, a 63-year-old apple grower with a dry sense of humor, drove by one afternoon and rolled down his window. Planning to feed the whole county's deer, Hannah? She smiled and kept sorting. Carl shook his head and drove on, muttering something about the rotten pear farm. Nobody knew what she was actually doing. Every morning, Hannah sorted fruit by ripeness. Every afternoon, she checked sugar content with a small handheld refractometer, recording the readings, the bricks, as she'd learned to call it, in her journal. Every evening, she washed, crushed, and pressed pears into buckets, watching, waiting, writing. The pages of her journal filled quickly. October 14th, batch 3, bricks 14.2. Crushed and set with wild yeast, temp 68 degrees Fahrenheit. October 19th, batch 1 smells off, vinegar sharp too fast, something wrong. October 22, batch 2 has mold on the surface, discarded. Nobody in town knew what those pages meant, but they meant everything to her. It was Carl, oddly enough, who mentioned Eleanor Brooks, a 71-year-old retired cider maker who'd spent 40 years producing traditional fruit vinegars before arthritis slowed her hands. Hannah found her sitting on a porch, surrounded by old oak barrels, and asked her plainly, "Will you teach me how to make vinegar?" Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "What feeds the yeast first?" Hannah blinked. "I don't know." "Then go find out. Come back when you do." It wasn't the answer Hannah expected, but it was the answer Eleanor always gave. She never explained anything directly. She only asked the question that would lead Hannah to the answer herself. Over the following weeks, that became their rhythm. Why does one batch smell sweet while another smells sharp? What happens when oxygen arrives too soon? Can time become an ingredient? Slowly, through trial, failure, and Eleanor's relentless questioning, Hannah began to understand the invisible world happening inside her buckets. The wild yeasts converting pear sugars into alcohol, and then, if she got the conditions right, acetic acid bacteria taking over, slowly transforming that alcohol into vinegar. It wasn't magic, it was chemistry, patience, and oxygen, working together in the dark. Nothing worked the first time, or the second, or the fifth. One batch grew a thick grey mold across the top because Hannah hadn't kept the crushed fruit fully submerged. Another turned flat and lifeless, no bite, no depth, because she'd rushed the aging. A carboy shattered in the cold one night, spilling 3 gallons of half-finished vinegar across the shed floor. Fruit flies swarmed a batch left uncovered for a single afternoon. 2 barrels leaked, soaking into the wood floor before she caught it. Each failure went into the journal, not as a defeat, but as data. November 8. Batch 4 ruined. Mold. Lesson. Fruit must stay submerged. Weighted lid needed. November 20. Batch 2 flat. Aged too fast. Bottled too early. Vinegar needs time, it cannot be rushed. Eleanor would nod at each disaster like it was expected. Vinegar punishes impatience, she said once. It rewards attention. Hannah began to understand that every failure was simply the fruit, the yeast, and the bacteria telling her something she hadn't yet learned to hear. Nearly a year after that first truckload of rejected pears rolled into her driveway, Hannah pulled a sample from barrel 7, one she'd nearly given up on twice, and tasted it. It was sharp but rounded, bright but deep. There was something in it that tasted like the oak, the pears, and the long cold months it had spent quietly transforming in the dark. She brought a bottle to a small farm-to-table restaurant an hour away. The chef, a skeptical man who'd tasted 100 amateur vinegars before, took a sip, paused, and asked, "Where did this come from?" "Rejected pears," Hannah said. "The ones nobody wanted." He ordered 6 bottles on the spot. That was the moment, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, when everything Hannah had been building for a year finally had a shape the world could taste. From that single order, Hannah didn't rush to expand. She grew the way vinegar grows, slowly, deliberately, 1 barrel and 1 customer at a time. She began selling barrel-aged pear vinegar at the county farmers market. She added herb-infused varieties. Eventually came a pear gastrique for chefs, tasting flights for visitors, and small gift boxes for the holidays. Local chefs recommended her to other chefs. Specialty grocery stores began stocking her bottles. Cooking schools invited her to demonstrate fermentation to students. Food festivals gave her a table, then a bigger table. None of it happened overnight. Trust, Hannah learned, isn't sold, it's earned, 1 honest bottle at a time. Eventually, restaurants began reserving barrels months before they were even finished aging. Hannah wrote every reservation into the back pages of her journal, the same journal that had once recorded nothing but failures. The waiting list became something she'd never expected to have. Proof. 2 years after that first handshake, David Mercer drove out to Hannah's farm, expecting to see, at best, a modest hobby. What he found instead stopped him at the shed door. Rows of oak barrels lined the walls, each labeled in Hannah's careful handwriting. Visitors sampled vinegar at a small tasting counter. A chef loaded cases of bottles into his truck. Hannah looked up from her journal and asked, almost casually, "Could you keep the Bartlett and Bosc pears separated next season? I'm getting different flavor profiles I want to track." David stood there for a moment, quiet. The fruit he'd once paid to throw away was now valuable enough that Hannah was requesting it be sorted more carefully, not less. "I'll get it done," he said. The real test came the year a brutal hailstorm tore through the valley, scarring nearly the entire commercial pear crop. Fresh market sales collapsed across the region. Orchards scrambled. But Hannah's business didn't just survive that year. It thrived. Cosmetically damaged fruit, the kind Hale leaves behind by the truckload, was exactly what her vinegar had always been built from. Carl showed up one afternoon with a trailer hitched to his truck. "Got another load if you can use it," he said, without a trace of his old joke about deer. The same fruit everyone else had once discarded had become the orchard's most dependable source of income in its hardest year. Hannah named the company Blue Ridge Orchard Vinegars. It became a respected regional brand, never a national chain, never a factory operation, just barrels, patience, and pears that once had nowhere to go. Schools brought students to tour the farm. Beginning farmers came to learn about value-added agriculture. Local chefs proudly listed her vinegar by name on their menus. Orchard waste across the valley began shrinking, one truckload at a time. The bruised pears had never really lost their worth. They were simply waiting for someone patient enough to see beyond the surface. Sometimes the finest harvest isn't the fruit that looks perfect. Sometimes it's the fruit everyone else leaves behind. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. The Farmland Files brings you a new one every week, and we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever turned something broken, rejected, or overlooked into something worth keeping, tell us that story too. We read every single one.